This podcast is supported by Synthesia. Training videos shouldn't take weeks to make. Synthesia lets you turn text into professional, multilingual training videos in minutes. It's fast, scalable, and so simple anyone can use it. You can write an email, you can make a video.
Hey there, my name is Alex, and I'll be guiding you through this training session.
70% of Fortune 100 companies use Synthesia to modernize onboarding, simplify compliance, and scale global training. Podcast listeners get an exclusive 30-day free trial. Go to synthesia.io/greatminds. Don't miss it. This offer won't last. Great Minds on Learning is supported by Talent Desk, one centralized place to onboard, manage, and pay all your freelancers and vendors seamlessly and compliantly.
Oh no. No. With Talent Desk, you get seamless freelancer management, so you have time to make yourself that well-deserved cup of joe without losing your mind.
Visit talentdesk.io/greatminds and get 1 month free. Plus, more time for coffee.
Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to Great Minds on Learning. In this acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of learning theory, from the Greeks to the geeks. This episode focuses on the Schoolmen, scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages. From Anselm's logic and Abelard's dialectics to Aquinas' synthesis of Aristotle and Catholic doctrine, they wrestled with questions of learning and truth. They bridged faith and classical learning to build the foundations of modern education, devising some of the first structured curricula in the West. While they may be mocked today as angel-counting pedants, their legacy endures on every university campus. Join Donald and John as they rediscover the Schoolmen and the surprising modernity of medieval minds.
So welcome to a new episode of Great Minds on Learning on Schoolmen. One of the things that working on this podcast has made me curious about is philosophy. Some time ago, as a result, I started listening to a podcast called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps by Peter Adamson, Professor of Philosophy at the LMU in Munich and King's College London. And it is just that, soup to nuts, every single scrap of philosophy from Greeks onwards. So we start with the pre-Socratics and Plato, Aristotle, Platonists, Neoplatonists, Aristotelians. So I worked my way through the series quite happily. When I got to the Middle Ages, I started to skip. And one of the things I skipped was a whole important area of philosophy, actually, probably a couple of dozen episodes, because, well, to be honest, it all looked a bit boring. Too much religion, too many mind-numbingly detailed arguments, propositions and refutations, too much metaphysics, too many angels dancing on the head of a pin. Meh, I thought, not doing that. Yes, folks, that's the period that we are covering today. But don't be alarmed. This will not be a snooze fest, I promise you, because if there's one person I know who can bring a dry and dusty old subject into blazing life, it's my co-host, the inimitable Donald Clark. Donald, I call this episode Schoolmen, just to keep the file name short, really. But what it's about is scholasticism, the philosophers who strove to reconcile classical philosophical thought with Christian doctrine, and what they thought about education and learning and what they did to start it up in an institutionalized way. For all the reasons I've mentioned, I don't know a huge amount about this stuff. I'm a bit of a tabula rasa. So give us an introduction to the subject area, the theorists you picked out, and why this matters for learning, above all.
Sure, John. Yeah, so I too have an interest in philosophy. That's what my degree was on, and all these. In fact, the majority of books behind me, there's 6 shelves up there that have nothing but philosophy books on them, and so I'm going to really enjoy this episode because these are indeed philosophical minds, and it is, as you rightly say, a bit of a gap here, sort of 11th to the 15th century. You know, that period, the medieval period, effectively. And people don't know much about them. They may have heard of, Aquinas or Scotus, or maybe Ockham, since he's quite popular. But the rest are somewhat of a mystery. Now, I think they're interesting in terms of the series because we call the series of podcast Great Minds in Learning. and all 7 of the people we're going to go through, quite a lot, but we'll get there, have theories of learning, what you would call direct theories of learning, and hopefully we'll tease these out as we go. But and that's why they're really called the Schoolmen. Remember I was in Fountains Abbey just 2 days ago in the north of England, an amazing ruin, the greatest ruin in England. These were huge establishments, but they were also teaching establishments. And all of these people did formally teach. In fact, that's the Latin scholasti from schola. That actually means school. So schoolman is just a translation from the Latin in that sense. But these eventually, of course, morphed into the modern universities, literally in terms of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. The earliest universities were really almost monastic and theological by nature. And they were teaching Aquinas and so on, and so we must remember that that's what this is. It's about people who they were teaching, of course, the trivium and the quadrivium, the curriculum of the day. But these people have a lot to tell us about pedagogy because they thought deeply about it. Now, they were sort of the reason we don't hear much about them is I think there was what happened in the Renaissance. People like Erasmus come along and he mocks them, saying, well, they were just sort of dancing on the head of a pin in terms of logic and so on, didn't have much to tell us. I think this is far from the truth. And there's been several revivals of the people I'm going to mention in philosophical thought. And also in terms of pedagogy. So that's what we're hopefully covered today. I hope that was a reasonable sort of introduction. The people, by the way, we are going to cover, we're going to start, and we're doing chronological order, is Anselm, who comes from Canterbury, famous for his ontological argument. Then with Paul Abelard from France, St Victor, Magnus, and then the big figure here, of course, is Thomas Aquinas. And the whole of Catholic education is based on Aquinas. That's important. And then we'll finish off with a Scotsman, Duns Scotus, and William Ockham, who comes from Ockham, which I think is somewhere north of Crawley or something. It's not far from us. But
Yeah.
those are the people we'll cover today.
I'm sorry, yeah. Mouth-watering menu. So let's get on with it. Anselm of Canterbury, 1033 to 1109. Interestingly, the one date that English people, if they know anything at all about history, will remember falls into that 1066. So that we can anchor that. It's the Norman invasion for Brits. They came over here. Doesn't tell us when they went away. Born in Aosta, in what is now northern Italy, Anselm became Archbishop of Canterbury and is known as the father of scholasticism. He famously proposed the ontological argument, which you mentioned there. That was his biggest hit, for the existence of God, arguing that God's existence is logically necessary. His motto, faith-seeking understanding, defined his approach to theology and reason. Despite his lofty ideas, he was embroiled in bitter political disputes with English kings, and this is the theme of the era leading up to, of course, to Thomas à Becket. Anselm was canonized in 1494, and Dante gave him a cameo in Paradiso, which makes him a rock star in religious and philosophical terms. So what did he have to tell us about learning?
Yeah, so that's right. So Anselm, who's French, but becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury after the William the Conqueror invasion of England. So not far from us along the coast.
Yeah.
And you're right, he's most famous for this ontological argument, which every philosophy student gets drummed into them. And it's illustrative of the way he thinks. So rather than going through the ontological argument, which is quite abstruse, his faith is in pure logic and deduction. And that the ontological argument is almost a canonical example of deduction in philosophical thinking. So we have this notion of pure logic, which is which shaped the medieval curriculum, was certainly part of it. So the trivia was grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Logic was literally part of the curriculum. Now, it's interesting that they all of these figures have reason and faith almost joined at the hip. But for Anselm, faith was terribly important here because he's joining. He's really saying that faith is fundamental here, and that all education is built upon faith. But that actually gives them some freedom. Once you accept the fact that faith is the bedrock or premise of a pedagogy, then it makes you it frees you up in terms of rational inquiry in education. And he was a rationalist. hence his faith in deductive logic. But he certainly thought that liberal education was an important thing. He wasn't sort of locking this thing down. He was opening the door into other forms of inquiry and words like the proslogion and so on. So we find in Anselm some really interesting pedagogic stuff about the foundations of faith. That was true of all these figures, but more importantly about the opening up of young minds. In fact, so reason in a sense for him was a sort of tool to unpack faith, if you want to put it that one. But you needn't worry about the goal. As long as the goal was faith, that was fine. In the process of unpacking your faith in Scripture, you would discover many wonderful things about the world. And so in that sense, is not these guys are very often, much more expansive and liberal in a funny sort of way than you would ever imagine. And I think it's interesting, Anselm, because a very famous philosopher died just recently, just 2 weeks ago, called Alistair MacIntyre. And Alistair MacIntyre was a famous moral philosopher and a secular guy, well known globally as a philosopher, but he had a crisis of reason, as it were, and became a Catholic and a follower of Aquinas, someone who will be talking later on. And I think it's interesting that someone as smart as MacIntyre can go back to that time and those people and still find an amazing amount of philosophical depth and pedagogic depth in their thinking. And I think Anselm's a good one to start off with, because that's what he did. He was integrating theology and philosophy, but more importantly, he was giving us a sense that learning is terribly important in terms of validation of your faith.
If you want to put a more cynical and atheistic spin on this, obviously this is a period where people, if I'm right, people are rediscovering classical texts and the works of philosophers like Aristotle and Plato via translations from the Muslim world, where those texts had been preserved, because during the Dark Ages it all been lost. So you have this kind of emergence of Greek philosophy and metaphysics, and this had to be reconciled with Christian faith. God had to be in there somewhere, because he wasn't there obviously for Plato and Aristotle, because they were pagans. So that there is a big theme with all these people of, how do we kind of restate these philosophical discoveries, but make sure that God is in there. If you would be cynical, it's kind of like, yes, this is metaphysics, but with a big thumb on the scales, in favor of God. Is that too cynical a take?
No, that in fact it's spot on. We did an episode indeed of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the pre-Socratics and some other Greek figures. The towering figures here, of course, are Socrates, maybe to a lesser degree, although we'll come to that because he influenced one of these figures. And then the other two, of course, are Plato and Aristotle. And of course, these come through the Arab world, but what comes through the Arab world? One is Plato's notion of the strength of universals. Some of them, that was a massive issue in the Middle Ages amongst these people, the argument about whether universals like treeness was a real thing. Was it an abstract universal dog or not? Plato's theories of form versus the empiricism of Aristotle. Now we see those two forces emerging in real tension amongst these figures. Some of them were lean towards the empiricism of Aristotle, and others towards the pure reason of Plato. But those two figures are ever present, since they were the primary texts that come through from the Arab world, along with some pre-Socratics. And then, of course, we have somebody in between here that we covered before, which is St. Augustine. And, of course, that's written in North Africa, and the Confessions and the City of God. That's another towering figure, but in many ways they diverge from St. Augustine towards the Aquinian, Aristotelian view of the world. So most of these people, of course, Catholics, and Aquinas set the pace for Catholic pedagogy, but they're more Aristotle than Plato in many ways. Interesting, I've just said that. Anselm was more towards Plato in the sense of his faith in pure reason.
Peter Abelard, 1079 to 1142, a brilliant and very controversial philosopher, scandalous in his lifetime, of course, born in Le Palais, Le Palais, it looks like to me, near Nantes. Abelard was the enfant terrible of the Parisian schools. A lot of French words for me to pronounce here and some Latin as well that I'm going to mangle. He challenged authority with sharp dialectic and personal arrogance, famously clashing with Bernard of Clairvaux. His love affair with Eloise, a gifted scholar in her own right, ended in scandal and, for him, castration. But their letters remain among the most intimate, enduring correspondences of the Middle Ages. I first heard about this when I was a teenager from TV. I think there was a BBC drama about Abelard and Eloise, and I think, if I got it right, Keith Michelle and Dinah Rigg of the Avengers played those part, and it was kind of portrayed as a love affair, but obviously it was a hugely scandalous event for people in his time. But he also had a lot of disputations with other philosophers and teachers. Abelard's "sic et non," or yes and no, laid out theological contradictions to train students in critical analysis. Donald, what's your critical analysis of Abelard?
Yes, I was interested. I've never seen anything on television on Abelard, but of course, the reason he's represented in fiction, I suppose, is it's a fascinating story. He falls in love with his student, the uncle gets mad, castrates him, which is a
Yeah.
bit dramatic, but it has that element of romance and tragic love. I can see it's a sort of Romeo and Juliet, really.
Yeah.
A spin on that. But in terms of focusing on his pedagogy for a minute, this is a really interesting figure because his method is what we would now call dialectical, the dialectical method. Interestingly, you know how I mentioned that notion of universals and particulars about the debate? He drove a line through the middle with a thing called conceptualism, which was quite clever, actually, in terms of avoiding the problem. And it was more Wittgensteinian in orientation, but that's a philosophical issue. This notion of sic et non, yes and no, in other words, debate and discussion, conflict, dialectic, was his pedagogic theory. Now, people think, well, dialectical materialism, so on, surely that came through Marx and Hegel much, much later. But here we have someone, literally in the 12th century, taking the same line. Yes and no, literally, sic et non in Latin, was his pedagogic theory. And this, of course, chimes in with many other figures in the past, most notably Socrates. So Socrates doesn't write a damn word, no text at all. What he does is engage his students in yes and no type debates, trying to uncover their ignorance. And that method, in a sense, you see shining through Abelard, because that goes on to the sort of critical theorists that we mentioned, like Freire and so on. That whole notion of critical thought, challenging, was part of Abelard's pedagogy as well. And in that sense, it's very sort of modern inquiry-based learning. Another major figure that I think is relevant here is Karl Popper, because Karl Popper thought that problem solving was the way we operated in the world, actually, but it was also the primary way in which we learned. Engaging learners in solving real problems, he thought, was how schooling should be constructed. And quite a famous book, which I've got behind me, actually, and called Objective Knowledge. And Popper's perhaps the most towering figure here in terms of copying Abelard, although it wasn't a direct influence necessarily. But you also have people like John Dewey, who believed greatly in problem solving, problem-based learning, I should call it. That, of course, had a big influence on problem-based learning in medicine and engineering in universities. Many follow that route rather than the traditional, here's a curriculum, you'll learn all this anatomy, then you go off and practice medicine. They flipped it so that you start with a problem, you start with a patient presenting, and then draw in the knowledge as you proceed. So I think Abelard is the first example of this real critical, challenging, yes and no debate, dialectical thinking or critical thinking, as we would now call it, in pedagogy.
And very lauded during his time. It's interesting to hear kind of, Hegel and so on prefigured here. Is there also an element with some of these scholastic philosophers of repeating things that had happened 100 years before with Avicenna and Averroes, that people have said that as well, that they not only throw forward, but throw backwards.
Yeah, I mean, there are dozens of other major figures in scholastic philosophy, but very few of them were directly engaged with pedagogy, which is our subject
Yeah.
today, but Bonaventure and many, many other figures here who were more purely philosophical or theological, because philosophy wasn't really an art then, it was really theology of one form or another. But you're right. But that was an interesting aspect of all this, because remember, books were held in monasteries in those days. The
Yeah.
books that came through, they all had scriptoriums, they copied these books, and these weren't huge libraries, at the most maybe sometimes 10, 20, 30, sometimes the biggest were like maybe 100, 200. But of course, it was a very bookish tradition, and therefore they naturally flowed one from the other, and tended to take, of course, scripture as absolute truth. To remember, this is a time when people really did believe that they were going to either heaven, hell, or in the case of Catholics, purgatory. And
Yeah.
so this was a serious business. It determined it determined what would happen to you for eternity. So it wasn't seen as a trivial issue. Pedagogy was a really serious thing. What can you do in this life to make sure that what happens to your soul it gets to heaven?
And it's worth saying that the University of Bologna was founded during his lifetime,
I think that's right.
1088,
Yeah.
and then the University of Paris shortly afterwards. And these institutions grew out of cathedral schools and monastic schools. So we're seeing the birth of the university at this point, and people like Abelard do a lot to kind of set the mold for what will happen in these universities.
Well, they do indeed. In the medieval curriculum that we mentioned earlier, Trivium
Yeah.
Quadrivium, were taught in these universities. Remember, these universities were few and far between. The only two
Oh yeah.
universities in England way up till the 18th century were Oxford and Cambridge. And
Yes.
and I've been to Bologna, and it's very interesting. These and of course Oxford, and they feel like monastic places. There weren't that
Yeah.
much which was from Fountains Abbey, very large, solidly constructed entities that were devoted to teaching and learning, and that's what monasteries feel like. And remember, they taught in lecture halls. They
Yeah.
look exactly like the modern lecture hall. Nothing
Yeah.
much has changed in that sense.
And the architecture, of course, is based on
Yes.
the monastic models as well, the kind of staircases and cloisters that you see in an Oxford college and so on.
There was one interesting thing I found in Fountains when I was. This is a massive place. You come over a ridge, and it's surprising because it's so big, and it's set in this very quiet valley. And they fled from York because York was too rowdy for them. They were purists.
Yeah.
And what was interesting there is a sense of silence, because they prayed. I think it was eight times a day, from dawn till dusk, as it were.
Yeah.
But they had a vow of silence. So these places would have been completely and utterly quiet apart from prayer and some song.
Yes.
And it's interesting that, that I think that gives them you must remember that's what the atmosphere was like. It was very scholarly, inward looking, intellectual in that sense. You had the time, peace, and silence to think and, of course, write, because they were, no one outside of those places could write. Literacy was rare. And so they had an intensity which made them like very intense schools, which is why perhaps they were wrapped up more with logic and hair splitting than empirical inquiry, but not all of them, as we'll find out.
Yeah. At the same time, it's worth saying that the reputation of students for raucousness and rebelliousness starts quite early. And I think I'm right in saying that many of these institutions were founded to protect scholars from the state, and to found an institution where they weren't kind of subject to the vagaries of, 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 of government quite so much, and persisted, and those struggles persist to this day. And another thing about Abelard, I think, with the mention of Eloise, it is worth mentioning, is that the place of women in this period. This is called the Schoolmen. This episode, they
Yes.
were all men.
Yeah.
Um, there were women who are important in these developments. Eloise being one of them, very much an intellectual foil to Abelard. And then you have people like Hildegard of Bingen, and I think Julian of Norwich was actually a woman, if I'm
right.
right.
Yes.
We haven't. I should say we haven't picked. by way of excuse, but having all men on the bill, we haven't picked any of the women because they didn't necessarily get involved with pedagogy in schools, and that's our focus.
Yeah, but yeah, I think we also have to remember that, you know, if you went to Fountain Abbey, there would be no women there. Women
Of course, they weren't allowed. I mean, it's
Yeah, they
not
weren't
until
allowed through the Porter's Gate.
turn of the 20th century that you really start to get women joining universities on the same basis as men.
Yeah, there's an interesting backdrop to this because we covered this a little bit, I think, in a previous podcast, which is we have, you know, the Library of Alexandria, which was the great secular place of learning.
Yeah.
And of course, that came to an end. It wasn't burnt down by a fire. It was actually went in disrepair because the Christians became censorious and moralistic about it all and wanted to burn the books almost. And the last major female figure then, of course, was Hypatia, a mathematician, a teacher who talked about learning and learning theory. But of course, she was crushed by scholasticism in that sense, although that's the 3rd, 4th century AD.
Yeah.
A long, long time ago before these people. But she's the last major intellectual figure with real stature from the secular world that we covered. But the truth of the matter is this was a process of brutal and almost universal exclusion of women. The names we hear there, Julian of Norwich and so on, are very few and far between. Yeah.
This podcast is supported by World of Learning Conference and Exhibition. L&D professionals, you need to be at World of Learning, the leading L&D event happening this 7th and 8th of October at the NEC Birmingham, UK. An unrivaled opportunity to learn, discover, interact and network. Register for free today at learnevents.com. Great Minds on Learning is sponsored by the Learning Technologies Awards 2025.
When they announced the gold winner, we were, it's us. Wow. It was really a very, very special moment.
It meant so much to win this award. It was a really proud moment for all of us.
The Learning Technologies Awards brings together the best in global learning technologies. It's a highly prestigious recognition of achievement and innovation.
Quality is very, very important, and learning technologies have got such an amazing reputation for quality.
They're really rigorous. They're not sort of just handed out. You know, you really have to demonstrate that this course has made an impact.
Winning can change lives, build careers, and turbo boost learning in your organisation.
Winning the award has brought a lot of recognition to our team, and it's really validated a lot of things that we're doing for the group. It is such lovely validation.
Basically, this confirmation that we're on the right track, that it makes impact, and that we're able to expand.
Apply today at learningtechnologiesawards.co.uk. Hugh of St Victor, 1096 to 1141. I think there's also a Richard of St Victor, and this was a community of learning, and I think they're known as the Victorines or the Victorines. But Hugh, our focus here, likely born in Saxony, I don't think anyone's sure, Hugh became a leading teacher at the Abbey of St Victor in Paris. He blended theology with mysticism and emphasized learning as a path to divine wisdom. His, I'm going to have problems with this, Didascalicon was a guide to the whole range of human knowledge, advocating for the integration of philosophy, science, and theology. Hugh was among the first thinkers to propose a structured curriculum. He's been called the second Augustine, but also once compared spiritual ignorance to a poorly constructed wall. We're all just a brick in the wall. We don't need no education. Obviously, he felt that we did. What did he tell us about learning, Donald?
Yeah, it's interesting. That it's an odd word, that, isn't it? I actually pronounced it slightly different as didascalion, because I think it's from
didascalion. Oh, right. Yeah, that sounds better than my mango.
I think we're both probably way off there, John. But now, I think this is interesting because we get down to a more sort of solid and identifiable pedagogy with this Hugh of St Victor. He has a theory, or almost it's called 7 stages in that book, in fact, 7 stages of knowledge acquisition. So he's a bit like Gagne, who we've covered previously, Gagne's 9 events of instruction.
Yep.
You remember that?
Yep.
And it's not exactly following this. Remember, he's a medieval theologian.
Yes.
but his 7 steps are actually quite interesting
Ah,
because they start with a very basic listen, just open your mind up to reading a lot of text. So the first one is actually literally in Latin lectio, reading lots of texts, widen your knowledge as far as you can. Then
yeah,
it goes into the second stage, which is a meditation or meditatio, which is the reflection on those texts.
yes,
Quite interesting. In other words, apply your critical thinking to what you have just read. Then it goes a bit wonky because remember, he's a theologian. You then have to go into prayer to unite.
right,
I mean, he had this notion of uniting knowledge in a pedagogic schema with spiritual wisdom. So he thought should always go back to scripture. And he had this analogy of, when you're walking into the ark as animals 2 by 2, use this analogy. Whenever you're learning something new, always pair it up with a theological principle or a story from the Bible, as it were. So
okay,
you've got that. That's the third stage. There's then this notion of the intuitive grasping of divine truth, which is a really important thing for all these figures. Remember, the goal here was always that uncovering of an absolute truth. In Anselm's case, a very strong argument for the absolutely logical conclusion that God must exist. That was
yeah,
his lifetime's goal, and the same was true of all these people. But coming back to St. Victor for a moment, he then goes into this is where it gets really interesting when you get rid of the theology, and the last 3 of his 7 stages sound really quite contemporary because
yeah,
the next one is the training in the liberal arts, the discipline of widening your learning out to a range of subjects. And then there's doctrine and actually an acquired body of knowledge. Remember, these people did not believe that you just sat down on a tabula rasa and everything you start thinking about the world in that philosophical sense. There was
yeah,
a body of given knowledge, an acquired body of knowledge that you had to get to grip with, primarily scripture, but also, of course, these texts we were mentioning that had come through Plato, Aristotle, and others.
yeah,
And then finally, there's the practice and intellectual habit forming. And this is where it gets really interesting, of course, because almost all the future schemas from Gagne, along with others like Rosenschein and school teachers would know Rosenschein, his 10 principles of instruction, or Marzano's 9 theories. There are lots of these theories around, but they all pick up on this notion that at some point you've actually got to get this stuff stuck in long-term memory through
yeah,
practice and intellectual habits forming. And this appears right now. Right, right in the 12th century is quite astonishing, really, that there's a sort of Gagne-type structured pedagogy, steps in learning, a practical model of 7 stages right there in his text.
yeah,
And that's interesting because you can compare them. He had some. It's interesting because this also influenced another person who came much later in the 17th century. I think we discussed, called Comenius, who comes along post-Reformation and thinks, listen, we've got to take learning really seriously. And he comes up with a pedagogy which is very structured in terms of steps. And he called it the universal education and starts to write textbooks, the first textbooks we see in mass schooling. And so we see these stages of learning and pedagogy evolve over hundreds of years, but they were there back to the 12th century. Just one last thing. He also thought that we should be keen on balancing practical skills with theoretical knowledge, something I think, and I've talked about this a lot, something that we've lost. And I don't think it's a good thing that we've lost this, but many of these people were practical people working in monasteries, that were involved in agriculture and beekeeping and making of ale and stuff. They were practical people. Fountains made their money on sheep rearing. It was one of the biggest in Europe. And so I think there was that notion of not only a hierarchical learning model, but also maintaining practical skills along with theoretical knowledge.
right. So in terms of pedagogy, this is the first time we come across something in this group that we could put on a PowerPoint slide and turn it to 7 steps and possibly turn it into a pyramid or,
God forbid.
yes, which people are then kind of spend a lot of time trying to fight their way out of. But yeah, that is so interesting that, we're getting the foundation of universities and educational institutions, and then we're starting to get a sense of structured curriculum, structured pedagogy as well. Is there anything more to say about Hugh of St Victor or the other Victorines or Victorines?
No, I think one thing is quite interesting is that is you touched upon this. It suddenly struck me. All these figures were quite mobile. They were they were all over Europe. Some of them
Yeah.
in Cologne and in Italy and certainly France and over here in England.
Yeah.
Of course, we've done Scotus, who was also ended up, I think, in the continent in Germany and France,
Yes.
Italy. So these were well-traveled people because they had a network. We have to see the medieval world as a network of monastic communities, and people
Yeah.
wander from one to the other and be put up and fed for free. It's quite unusual. It doesn't really exist. You can't just wander around Europe, popping into places and getting free food and, and bed for the night, as well as an education.
Yeah. Well, you can't
But
wander around Europe in the way that you could before Brexit, but we won't talk about that.
yes,
It is interesting that there is a kind of the growth of a Europe. You're not going to like the sound of this. There is a group of European culture here during
yes,
this time, and it's a lot to do with language. I mean, it's worth remembering that most of this was in French and Latin.
yeah,
Of course, England at that time, there was a lot of French because of the Norman invasion.
yeah,
English literature, really, I think part of the reason this is a blind spot for me, this era, is that English literature doesn't really start until after this era with Chaucer, and that's where English as vernacular English becomes the lingua franca of the nation. And before that, all this that we're talking about here was all carried out mainly in Latin,
yes,
and that gave a kind of universal language for scholars that meant there really was a kind of community of people. Perhaps this is where we see the beginning of this kind of division of the university educated and the university uneducated,
yeah,
that persists to this day. But it kind of happened in England with the Norman invasion, because the Normans became the aristocratic class. The Saxons were kind of down in the fields. You start to get two words for everything,
yeah,
which Borges has described as one of the wonders of the English language. You have a Latin word, and you have a kind of English equivalent, and a lot of French in there as well. My point really here is that the language is such an interesting aspect of all this
oh,
as well,
yes.
that we shouldn't forget, really. It's interesting that English became the lingua franca of business and
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of turned on itself, really, isn't it? There weren't enough Normans, only 10,000 of them, to really influence the language. So English carried on regardless, and eventually through the US and now global dominance, of course. I'm just back from Africa, where it was involved in a huge debate on this as to whether AI was eliminating. It was a form of erasure in all minor languages, but English is certainly the lingua franca, certainly the replacement for Latin. There is something quite pragmatic and practical about this, because it's actually quite useful to have one language
yeah.
globally for aviation and shipping and business and so on, because it's convenient. And Latin was a convenient vehicle in the Middle Ages, although exclusionary, of course, because you had to learn it and it was difficult. You can only learn it in certain places. But that's become true of English now. It was interesting. I was hearing about, there are people in India who actually put their standard of English on their dating site
Oh, wow.
profiles because it's become an aspirant language in terms of getting visas or social advancement or going to university in another country,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. But
Signaling.
something similar has happened, hasn't it, with
Yeah.
languages? Very interesting.
Actually. So let's crack on. Albertus Magnus, circa 1200 to 1280, born in I'm going to mangle another European language now. Born in Launingen, Bavaria.
German.
Albert was known as the Universal Doctor, or Doctor Universalis, for his encyclopedic knowledge. He taught Thomas Aquinas and was one of the first medieval scholars to engage deeply with Aristotle's newly translated works. A Dominican friar and bishop, he worked to harmonize faith with empirical science. Albert had an interest in alchemy, and legend credits him with creating a mechanical automaton that could talk. I mean, legend credits him with a lot of things, and he turns up a lot in the 19th century and the birth of the Gothic as being kind of, these books that people would have in their libraries with all the dark arts in them. Albertus Magnus is supposed to be one of these people, and a father of alchemy and all the rest of it. Most of it is tosh, as far as I can see. But he was canonized and later made a doctor of the church, and he's the patron saint of scientists. Donald, what can you say about Albertus Magnus?
Yes, well, going back to our debate previously about the influence of Plato and Aristotle, Magnus is 100% an Aristotelian, an empiricist, and as you rightly said, it surprised me. I first came across him in the AI stuff because in all that discussion about robots, he was allegedly the man, as you rightly said, who built this talking metal head. Robot. It actually supposedly talked, which is interesting. And then famously, his pupil, as you rightly said, Thomas Aquinas, thought it was a demon or demonic and smashed it to pieces. Well, it's almost like a metaphor for the modern sort of doomsters in AI. But he was an Aristotelian, and I suppose that Gothic thing's interesting because he was known to have dissected animals. It was very, very rare in those days. And catalogued minerals. He was a geologist as well, interested in agriculture. And even beekeeping was a big thing for him, and argued that bees had souls, which was actually quite heretical at that time. It was often quite dangerous to make statements like bees have souls. You could end up on end up in the fire for such statements. But he was a natural empiricist, of course, Aristotelian in flavour, and has a book called De Mineralibus, which is all about that sort of empirical stuff and rocks and animals and bees and so on. But his pedagogy was to broaden your knowledge out into the real world, the physical world that you saw around yourself in a monastery, let's say at Fountains, which would be, the living animals in the woods, the birds, the bees, the fauna and flora, as well as the beekeeping and husbandry and so on. All that stuff was terribly important for this guy. And so this is the first big empiricist, a sort of scientific pedagogy, you might be better described as. And I think that's important because we don't think of these people as being like this, as having a pedagogy that's based on observation and experimentation as well, and empirical knowledge. And of course, we have things like genetics that come through Mendel much later in these monastic communities. They were much more experimental than you might imagine, experimenting with lenses, the first glasses appear and all this sort of stuff. So I think it's important because they lead on to people like Francis Bacon, John Dewey, of course, experiential learning by doing, all that theory that we've discussed in other podcasts.
Yeah.
He is the first example of this in its pedagogic form.
Right. So is this where we get the beginnings of the science department?
Indeed.
As far as obviously it's a big feature of universities nowadays. You have the arts and you have the sciences, and never the twain shall meet sometimes. But he brings that into this, does he?
Yes.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit neatly into the medieval curriculum.
Yeah.
Trivium and quadrivium, but it starts to. It's a real thing because these were communities that existed in the real world, and they were incredibly smart, intellectual people who were curious about the real world as well as the spiritual world.
Yeah.
And that's why it's interesting that this emerges so early. We're talking 13th century here.
Yeah.
That we have empiricists, people experimenting, cataloging, doing all the things that we would see in a modern science department. And that certainly had a future influence on people. We see that, as I say, with Mendel and all sorts of people that flew out of those communities at one point.
Yeah. It's worth saying, though, to argue against my own point there, that both the term arts and sciences and science had a different sort of flavour of meaning, really, at this time.
Yeah. Well, scientist comes much later in the 19th century. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But interesting. Let's move on to his star pupil.
Yes.
Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274. A name that I've heard ever since I toddled, having been a cradle Catholic, though never really got to grips with his works, must admit. Born in Roccasecca, Italy, there's another European language, bites the dust, into a noble family. Aquinas studied under Albertus Magnus and became the leading figure of high scholasticism, and massively famous, especially within Catholicism, for centuries afterwards. Some people say he's more famous than he actually was influential, but that's for other people to argue. His Summa Theologica remains a cornerstone of Catholic doctrine, attempting to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. Known for his methodical clarity and vast learning, Aquinas was dubbed the angelic doctor. Despite his intellectual heft, he was once nicknamed the dumb ox by fellow students. Albertus reportedly retorted, "This ox will bellow so loud, the world will hear him," and the world certainly did. Donald, what have you heard from Aquinas?
Well, bellow he certainly did. Towering figure, not only in theology, in the Catholic world specifically, but also more generally as an intellectual figure of that period. And to focus wholly, I mean, this is a very wide-ranging guy, Summa Theologia is huge canonical text, but on pedagogy, we have this first emergence in its embryonic form of that notion of learning being a real process. How does it happen in the brain? So Aquinas discusses the role of sensory experience in babies and young children. So we get, it's a bit like David Hume, you get he thought of the empirical primacy of sensory experience, not into tabula rasa like Locke, in other words, he was quite modern in a sense. He thought that the brain brings things to the world and isn't just receptive to sensory experience. And then your intellect starts to abstract through language into universal concepts. So teachers are not implanting knowledge, just open your mouth and pour it in, but guiding students towards this discovering of truths. This is the first time we get that more sophisticated idea of the agency of the learner.
Yeah.
And because they are capable of understanding, this is not something you teach them, it's a given. We seem to have this. Now, he thought that was a God-given gift, of course, God-given reason, literally. But nevertheless, if we accept that it's true, he's in line with people like Piaget, Vygotsky, and so on, and thinking that there's intellectual cognition, almost constructivist in his view, if you want to put that one, perhaps stretching it a little bit. But he certainly thought that was how we learned through a number of things. He brings all that together a little bit, like dialectics, empirical learning, conceptual thinking, reflection, and so on. But we have a sophisticated pedagogy that seriously influences Ignatius and all these other figures that we've talked about, because the Catholic Church was the church. It was globally dominant until the Reformation, and therefore this was how people were taught. And in a sense, that was a good thing, because it wasn't as restrictive as you might imagine. It opened the world up to a sort of liberal arts view of the world, that the learner had agency and that we were encouraging people in a learning journey, as opposed to being purely doctrinal.
Yeah. Interesting. To put it in a bit of context, at the time of his birth, the university movement, if it's a movement, it was growing. So just give some dates around that. University of Oxford in the UK was formally chartered in 1248.
Yeah.
During his lifetime, I think. University of Cambridge had been founded in 1209. University of Salamanca, 1218. University of Padua, founded 1222. So during all this time, the universities are growing up, and that's the kind of educational milieu that he's swimming in and that his teachings go into.
That's right. I was in the University of Salamanca last year, curiously, and it was absolutely fascinating. Our ancient university with ancient lecture halls and rooms, which you can wander around in to this day. And that was an Aquinian-based establishment, and still going today, of course. Students were there in those very same rooms, interestingly, being taught. Isn't that fascinating? And therefore it lives on, and Aquinas and this pedagogic notion that young people have to have their minds opened and exposed to existing learning, but also seeing themselves as learners was an important thing.
Yes. So his influence to kind of tackle that dispute I mentioned earlier, although he's hugely famous, has he been that influential as far as learning is concerned?
Well, I don't think really on learning, because although I've mentioned, let's say, Piaget and Vygotsky, seeing learners and actively processing experience, Piaget was I don't like Piaget. I think he was a terrible scientist, sort of baked scientist, really. And his theory, four-stage theory, turns out to be wrong anyway. But nevertheless, you have that influence on, if he has any influence at all, it's It's not in the, the divine spark within learners, but their ability to develop, grow, reflect, and become active, proactive learners. Now, I'm not too sure that's a causal influence at all, either on Piaget or certainly not on Lev Vygotsky, certainly not. But parallels have been drawn, and I think they tend to be parallels rather than influences.
Of course, anyone who grew up in the Catholic tradition will have known about Aquinas. Of course, people like
Yeah.
Thomas More and, on and on and on, and the
Yes.
Jesuits and so on. Duns Scotus, 1266 to 1308, likely born in Duns, Scotland.
Yep.
Scotus was a Franciscan theologian, as opposed to a Dominican, known for his subtlety, hence his title, the Subtle Doctor, or Doctor Subtilis. He championed the Immaculate Conception and emphasized the will's role in moral action, contrasting with Aquinas' more intellect-driven model. Scotus was a formidable logician, and his doctrine of univocity of being challenged the prevailing analogical view. I think analogues were talked about a lot in Aquinas. Not quite sure I understand any of that, really. Though later followers gave us the word dunce, originally it was meant as a compliment to his intellectual rigor, until Renaissance thinkers turned it into an insult. Now, when I started my kind of research for this episode, I was thinking of all sorts of witty little quips I could make on his name, but then realised that was useless to do that because they'd been doing that since he was first around. And in fact, that's where we get the origin of the word dunce from.
That's right.
Is from him, originally a term of approbation. So, Donald, what approbation do you want to give him as an influence on learning?
Yeah, well, of course, he was a Scotsman.
Well, apart from that, yes.
And he did wear a pointed hat, which is interesting. Now, the place Duns, interestingly, tangential, but my nephew was married in Duns just last year. I know the town quite well. Tiny little place. Not far from there, James Hutton, another towering figure in geology, deep time in Darwin, was born just up the road and had a farm. And David Hume, you can sort of, it's further across as well. So it's quite a fertile ground for intellects, this area. But you're right about the dunce thing. I mean, most people unwittingly know the word dunce through dunce, the dunce's hat, the pointed hat, which Duns Scotus actually wore and was still alive and kicking. It's mentioned in Charles Dickens, for example. It was a feature of Western education for centuries. You would shove a pointed hat. You sometimes had a D written on it. It's slightly amazing that this little town in Scotland suddenly became this sort of weird thing. But of course, it was actually a thing of admiration. Duns Scotus's followers wore the pointed hat to show their intellectual vigor, and these were logicians by and large. I mean, Duns Scotus was really unique amongst these people in that he was a logician, and there's just this fearsome intellect.
Yes,
you didn't mess with this guy. He travelled across Europe, as we mentioned earlier. And out of Scotland into England, across to France, and then I think he ended up in Germany in Cologne. But he was, a man with a European reputation as being the smartest man alive. Now, coming back to his pedagogy, this is the first pedagogic theory in this group that talks about just an intuitive grasp of knowledge. He thought that was based, of course, on the God-given divine inspiration around logic. And in a sense, he's thinking of logic. Let's think about mathematical logic, or think about his maths for a minute. Maths is applied to arguments. He thought that we had that because that's what the world was like. That was God. Our intuitive cognition, in other words, let's say our grasp of logic and mathematics, actually is a God-type gift because that's what God is. And humans grasp knowledge directly and immediately. That's what we get if we go straight for the logical deductive process. We sort of shortcut the pedagogic process by getting straight to the truth of the matter if we take it seriously. So, it's all about this sort of direct logic and intentionality and learning. Like, we're after this, we're going to go for it. The way to get there is through deductive logic. Now, and this is a feature, of course, of scholasticism in general. And if you read any of the text, they are torturous
Yes.
unless you have a real focus and start following the logic. And a good way to dip your toe into this is just pick up a book or go to ChatGPT or something and look at Anselm's ontological theory for the existence of God. Now, it's only about 5, 6, 7 steps, but it's torturous to get your head around. I mean,
Yes.
it's mind-blowingly intense. And
Yes.
that's why Duns Scotus was regarded as a very intense figure. And, arguing so hard and vigorously that he would sometimes fall over with the effort of it all. And but this notion that pure reason and mathematics and deduction is what education is about had a very strong influence. And we still today, shove mathematics down the throats of every young child until they're 18. You can't become a car mechanic unless you've got your GCSE in maths, don't you know? But and I think it's a mistake. It's a mistake that was because that notion that mathematics is a transferable knowledge to other things in life is false. And I think we're still captured by this medieval curriculum that thinks that logic, and through mathematics, it's a damn good thing for everybody. And if only we were all professors of mathematics, the world would be a wonderful place. This is far from the truth, of course, but nevertheless, it has survived. But I don't think it's necessarily a good thing. Now, that's not to say that that's not Duns Scotus's fault. I mean, what he did was apply his hair-splitting logic, but logic nevertheless, which is a good thing, and the focus of how individuals learn and get to know distinct entities in the world. What is a dog? What is a tree? What's this universalism all about? It was about the particulars and not just universals as well. So we come back to this universals versus particulars argument.
Yeah.
The pursuit of knowledge was about the pursuit of both. And he saw philosophy as a really rigorous discipline here, requiring very precise reasoning. Now, that's not far off what people in, for example, the AI world, they thought that we could mimic intelligence by applying pure logic and reason in code. It's turned out to be not quite right. And actually, large language models turned out to be the thing that really cracked the code here. In other words, the world might not be as logical as you might imagine. Of course, physicists and mathematicians would argue otherwise, but many people think that both physics and mathematics, in a sense, is partly a social construct, but constructed by us. And so it's a complicated area. We could spin off into all sorts of philosophical themes here.
Yeah, it's interesting that all that stuff about the dunce and the dunce's hat, we start to get a flavour of the reaction and the pushback that the Renaissance, subsequent ages had towards scholasticism. How is this kind of angels dancing on a head on a pin, all the kind of essences and the disputes about the soul and whether the angel can actually be in two places at once and all the rest of it. Kind of pedantry and dry as dust intellectual arguments, and people pushed back against all that stuff a great deal. These kind of, I don't know, dialectical to and fro of one age rejecting the wisdom of another age, and another age is obviously a kind of part of the way that it all progresses intellectually, I suppose. But I mean, a lot of it's stuck, the dunce's hat and so on.
Isn't it rather strange? I wrote in my book, Learning Technologies, about the dunce's hat as a sort of, the technology of punishment. We have the sticks and paddles that are still alive and kicking in some states in the US. We had the cane in Victorian schooling. So the technology of punishment was quite an interesting thing in education. And I always blame the student, And this goes back to a theological basis for this, of course, because it's about being sinful. In other words, being stupid or not learning quickly enough was a sinful act because you're not pursuing this goal of knowledge and an understanding of God. So we have this, which is still alive and kicking in schooling today. The theological shadow of good versus bad, good versus evil, and sin in the mind of the learner is alive and kicking in the modern schoolroom. We may have banned the technology, but it's still the dunce's, the naughty step or the dunce's hat is still there and transformed into other forms, detention rooms and all sorts of things. The shaming of young people has been a common feature of education for a couple of centuries. So it is very interesting to reflect on that a little bit about what actually carried over here. The hat.
Yeah.
It's
Well, let's
strange.
leave that to the summing up. I mean, we have one more pointy-headed schoolman to cover here before we get there. William of Ockham, circa 1287 to 1347, born in Surrey, England, of all places. Ockham was a Franciscan friar and a fiery critic of papal authority. He's best known for Ockham's razor, the principle that simpler explanations are generally better, a methodological tool still used in science today and very oft-quoted by you, Donald.
Yes.
In my memory. He separated theology from philosophy, as well as Elon Musk as well. He separated theology from philosophy more radically than his predecessors and anticipated aspects of modern political theory. After excommunication, he was excommunicated, he lived under protection of the Holy Roman Emperor, whom he defended against the Pope, famously saying, "I must obey God rather than man," and perhaps throws forward to the Reformation in that sense. Donald, what could we say about William of Ockham, apart from his razor, or perhaps including his razor?
His razor, yes. He's by far my favourite in the list because of Ockham's razor. You know, that principle of the minimum number of entities to reach your given goal.
Yeah.
And I've spent all my life looking at learning theory and applying learning theory and technology and so on. And this is the principle that I have perhaps used the most because we have now in modern, I mean, it's most visible in modern theories and cognitive load. I mean, this is someone who reflected on the deep nature of learning and understood that the mind took shortcuts almost and had to look for the simplest explanation of any given phenomenon, which is what Ockham's famous razor is, and as you rightly said, is actually applied with absolute rigor by Musk in all of his major businesses, and has become a sort of methodology, really. I mean, it's always been a methodology in science. You look for the simplest theory to apply to the given data set or findings or insights that you see. But it's almost like a general principle that's very, very useful in life, I think. That's how certainly I see it. But we have people like, you could say it has an influence on people like John Sweller with cognitive load theory. You know, I often say this, but the history, if you had to sum up the psychology of learning in 3 words, it would be less is more. And that's an Ockhamite statement in many ways, a principle of simplicity. The simplest explanation is usually the best. It's efficient, it's uncluttered, and that's, if you go with that, it tends to result in good things. And I think his, that he was all about conceptual clarity in learning. Was don't get muddled. So this goes back to the go back to this again, universals versus particulars. He did not believe in universals at all, universal abstract nouns. He would have ridiculed an abstract noun like creativity or critical thinking or collaboration or whatever, all these C words. He would have brought things back to the particular. Interestingly, Musk often takes the same line here. He said we get carried away by these abstractions and processes and methodologies, the MBA type business theory, when in practice things are much more empirical, get stuck into looking at the problem and try to solve it empirically. Take shortcuts, get rid of things, automate stuff. The simplest route is often the cheapest, best, and fastest. And that's true in a pedagogy as well, which I thoroughly believe, which is why I've always admired Occam's razor. So it's nice to end on this because I think this is the one whose theory has survived the longest, the razor theory, but I think he's right. I think he's absolutely right here in that we get carried away with with abstract nouns, universals, and reify them and thinking that they're real things. We suddenly have courses on them, and education goes to pot because it's too abstract, de-anchored, disassociated from reality. And this is what Ockham actually literally says. And that we would be well to go back to a more basic pedagogy that doesn't believe in such universals or thinks that they are misleading.
You made a couple of really interesting connections there with the modern age and our own time that I'd like to follow up in the summing up, perhaps. Is there anything more to say about Ockham apart from his razor? I mean, famous and illustrious people are often frustrated as they near the end of their days that they're known only for one thing. Should we only know Ockham for his razor, or is there anything else to him that relates to learning?
I mean, to be honest, I think that's enough because it has had such a profound influence on the scientific method and on practical engineering and business and commerce and so on. I think, I would be glad if I went to my grave having only come up with that one thing as William of, came up with many other things. I mean, you must remember all these people, there's very deep and wide philosophical schemas underlie all of this. There isn't just a little description of his razor. In fact, it's quite a sort of minor and minor aspect of his thinking in general, but it's the one that survived. And there is something about survival, isn't it? Survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
It survived because it's been useful and applicable, especially in the
relevant.
scientific method, but also in other areas of human endeavor.
Okay, let's move on to summing up then.
Sure.
So summing up, how do we sum this up, Donald? What changed in the thinking about learning and education during this period?
Well, I think, and it's the shift really from, this might sound odd, but you might think they're doctrinaire or ideological in some sense, but you have the shift from what was effectively 1,000 years of Plato and Aristotle or not much happening. An absolute fixity on holy books, of course, whether it was the Bible, the Gospel, Torah, or the Quran from the 7th century onwards. So suddenly we have this group of thinkers, 11th to 15th century, who take a really deep dive. And when you say deep, try reading some of this stuff. I mean, it is so intellectually powerful and interesting if you have the sort of stamina for it, as it were. That, Magnus, Scotus, Aquinas, and Abelard, and so on, you have, a theory of intellectual cognition. You have the role of observation and learning. Sticking to the pedagogy, you have a theory of intuitive knowledge, dialectical methods. All these modern ideas are there in what we regard as the Dark Ages or medieval thought. And some of them, of course, as we've just discussed, have had direct influences, the whole Duns thing, but certainly Occam's razor and certainly Aquinas. So they're alive and kicking, even although nobody reads these people any longer. Some of their ideas have certainly survived. And the ones that we've covered so far, logical and dialectical thinking, certainly empirical learning and observation from Magnus, certainly hands-on learning, scientific method. And then, of course, we have Occam's razor, conceptual simplicity and economy of thought, which is a big feature in obviously even in artificial intelligence and so on now. And in structured educational system, Hugh of St Victor gives us the Gagne thing. It's there in his text. Sort of learning steps or a method of going into a classroom and having a structured curriculum method of teaching so that learners can develop themselves.
Lesson plans.
That's exactly what it was. Exactly what it was. A sort of divine or theological lesson plan. And then, of course, Aquinas with his integration of rationalism and theology, but still a dose of empiricism, bridging faith and reason. So I think these are very modern thinkers if you extract stuff from them and don't regard them as theologians. Of course, theology was the premise, but if you strip the theology away, what's left are some very contemporary and modern theories of education and learning.
And what happened afterwards? We talked a bit about the backlash in subsequent ages, but what hairs are set running during this period that lead us on to what will happen in the Renaissance, then the Reformation, and the Enlightenment afterwards?
The Reformation is the big one, of course, but the Renaissance also. But we have in the Reformation the outright rejection of Catholicism and therefore anyone associated with it. And Erasmus was a bridging figure here. But we suddenly get the scientific revolution, in the 17th century and then 18th century Enlightenment, which really strips the theology away, becomes much more secular, belief in progress. So the scientific revolution is massive, Bacon and others. And then, of course, that emerges into the modern world. The Reformation is massive here. And it goes back to a little thing that we discussed in our podcast when we mentioned Peter Thiel, who had a very interesting analysis of this, that, education still today has echoes of medieval thought. It's almost, the modern university is almost like an entity that sells indulgences. You have to pay for your degree or you go to hell. and it's almost something that existed in the eve of the Reformation, and that what we need is a Reformation to get rid of the theological basis of even the modern university.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting we pick up on that dunce idea, the notion that let's blame the students and learners. I was on a webinar last night, interestingly, from the States, where the academic was doing that 100%. Oh, students aren't as good as they used to. They can't write. They make spelling
I
errors.
don't read anything.
AI stuff is ruining their minds.
They
They're
cheat.
becoming stupid. It was almost like, yeah, let's put
They
a dungeon
smell.
hat on everyone then.
They've got interesting hair, I think, Catherine. So what, if anything, moving on to Arendo, you made really interesting links there between Ockham and Sweller, and from Ockham's razor to Musk's chainsaw, but we've kind of we will be dealing with him later in the year. What, if anything, that we take for granted in today's educational systems and in learning can we trace back to the innovations of this period? Just to note on architecture, actually, I went to Sussex, a modern plate glass university, what is now called Mandela House, in Sussex, built by Basil Spence. You can't get through from one room to another room adjacent to it on the first floor. You have to go down to the ground floor and go back up. And that's because the architecture of it comes from the architecture of Oxford colleges, which are arranged in staircases, because a lot of them were set up before the invention of the corridor in the 19th century. So they're kind of like little vertical buildings shoved together. I mean, that's kind of a physical manifestation of the way that things persist in architecture in the physical world as well as in the intellectual world. But what are the intellectual things that we picked up that we can trace back to this period?
No, it's a very interesting observation, that, John. You made me think about my trip 2 days ago at Fountains Abbey, because I think the thing that survived the most, funnily enough, is the campus university, the notion of which is really a monastery of sorts, And when I was wandering around Fountains, it was interesting because there was like the student union, the refectory. You had these places, scriptoriums, where books, and like the library. You had places where people were taught, and if you go into a modern campus, and I've been on many, I spend a lot of time talking at universities, and I've done so across the world, they all have that same link back to medieval Europe and the physical structure of a monastery, where you have a priesthood, you have lay people going around, the janitors and so on, doing all the hard work. You have a priesthood, you have a very strict hierarchy even within that priesthood, and then you have, of course, the degree, which comes out of the guild notion of the building of cathedrals and so on. So there is this, it's very interesting, Hugo, in I think it was in one of his novels, I can't remember, whatever the novel was, the one based on the Hunchback of Notre Dame. He has a great chapter in that novel right at the beginning where he says, actually, to understand a culture, you should look at its stone architecture. History is written in the stones. And then perhaps that's the surviving thing, the campus university, where kids go and live in dormitories. It is a dormitory model. They go from Brighton to Manchester or Bristol or Leeds or whatever for a few years. They become monastic for 3 or 4 years. They get inculcated with the doctrine, and they get given their degree at the end, and they wear an outfit that actually the mortarboard and so on, that comes directly from that world.
But not a pointed hat.
Yes, another strange hat.
Not a pointed hat.
But it's a world of ritual, lectures, libraries, dormitories, refectories. It's very monastic in feel. And you're absolutely right, even though Sussex is just across the hill from where I'm sitting at the moment, that has that feel about it, set down in a valley amongst the woods a little bit.
Yes.
And maybe that's the surviving thing, the structure of an isolated community that becomes inward-looking with a priesthood that learns. And there's something very sort of weirdly religious about a modern university.
And with under their pointy hats, pointed heads sometimes. Okay, well, what that leads us on to is what AI and whatever and technology are going to do to kind of dissolve that model in the future, and what we see happening on that side of things. And we are going to cover that in a subsequent episode.
Yes.
So thank you very much for that, Donald. I feel I've learned a fantastic amount there. And I won't ever look down upon the scholastics again, although I don't think I'm going to read Aquinas.
Well, I've really enjoyed it. It made me go back and read some of the people I've read years and years ago as a student. And, it's a joyous thing to delve into things that your brain has forgotten, but even on the second time round are really interesting, aren't they? And relevant. That's the important.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. We'd also like to extend a heartfelt thanks to our sponsors for this season.